Ever get the feeling that, like, the news is just flying past you like a million miles an hour? You're trying to keep up with what's happening in the world, but it's hard to really get a grasp on how these big global issues actually impact people, you know, like in their everyday lives.
I totally get that. It's so easy to get caught up in the headlines and miss the human side of things.
Well, today we're going to slow things down a bit and take a really close look at a situation that could have some seriously tangible, real-world consequences.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're talking about Iraq's energy situation.
Ah, interesting.
Specifically, what could happen if they suddenly lose access to Iranian power? Like, imagine the lights going out, and not just for a few minutes. And we're not just speculating here. We've been diving deep into some really insightful reporting, especially from newsroom Chella Smith.
Okay, I'm all ears. This is definitely something we should be paying attention to.
So let's set the stage here. Our sources indicate that Iraq is currently importing a significant amount of its electricity directly from Iran.
How much are we talking?
It's estimated to be somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 megawatts. And that's not all.
Oh, wow, that's not a small amount.
They're also relying on Iranian natural gas to keep many of their own power plants up and running.
So it's not just electricity, it's the fuel to generate their own electricity too.
Exactly. So you can see how deeply intertwined their energy system is with Iran.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant dependency. It's not like losing a small extension cord, that's for sure.
Right. It's more like their entire energy grid is plugged into Iran's system. And this dependence really stems from a fundamental challenge that Iraq faces.
Which is?
Their own ability to produce electricity and their energy infrastructure as a whole just hasn't kept up with the growing demand within the country.
So they've had to turn to these Iranian imports as a kind of a stopgap measure.
Exactly. But it's a stopgap that's become essential, you know, almost like this lifeline they're relying on. But as we'll see, it's a lifeline that might not be all that secure.
Okay, so that brings us to the big question. What happens if that lifeline gets cut? What if those Iranian energy imports suddenly stop flowing?
Yeah, that's the crux of it, right? What are the consequences for Iraq if they're suddenly forced to go it alone, energy-wise?
Well, if you think about the scale of those imports we were talking about, the most immediate and obvious impact would be a massive energy shortage.
Like rolling blackouts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but potentially much worse than that. We're talking about the very real possibility of widespread and prolonged power outages across the country.
Wow, that's a pretty scary thought.
Especially when you consider that this would be happening during those brutally hot summer months when demand for electricity is already at its peak.
Oh yeah, of course. To run air conditioners and just basic cooling.
Exactly. And it's not just homes that would be affected. Hospitals, businesses, essential services, everything would be struggling to function without reliable power. And Reuters.com, which has been doing some great reporting on this, really drives home the severity of this potential scenario.
And it's not hard to imagine the chaos that would ensue, right? Like we all get annoyed when the power goes out for a few minutes, but imagine that happening for hours or even days on end.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame. Food spoiling in refrigerators, businesses unable to operate, vital medical equipment failing. The ripple effects would be enormous.
And that brings us to the next level of consequence, which is the economic impact.
Right, because a reliable energy supply is absolutely essential for a healthy economy.
Businesses can't produce goods, services grind to a halt, people lose their livelihoods. It just spirals, doesn't it?
Exactly. And on top of that, if Iraq is suddenly scrambling to make up for that lost energy, they might have to turn to more expensive and less efficient options, like those smaller diesel generators that you often see humming away.
Right, I've seen those, especially in countries with unreliable grids.
Well, those can be a temporary fix, but as Wikipedia points out, they come at a high cost. They're not designed for continuous operation, they guzzle fuel, and the pollution they generate is pretty nasty.
So it's like this double whammy. You lose the cheap energy from Iran, and then you're stuck with this expensive and dirty alternative. That can't be good for their economy.
Absolutely not. It's like trying to power a city with a bunch of lawnmower engines. It's just not sustainable in the long run.
And then, of course, there's the social dimension. When people are struggling with these kinds of basic necessities like not having electricity, it's a recipe for unrest, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen this pattern play out time and again throughout history.
I mean, haven't there been protests in Iraq in the past that were sparked, at least in part, by frustrations over power shortages and things like that?
Yes, absolutely. And Wikipedia actually documents some of these protests, particularly those that occurred between 2015 and 2018. They were largely driven by public anger over inadequate services, and electricity was a major factor.
So the historical precedent is definitely there.
Exactly. So you can imagine how a sudden and severe loss of power could easily reignite those frustrations and lead to social unrest.
It's a pretty grim picture, isn't it? Like a cascade of negative consequences.
It is. But it's not a story of complete helplessness. There are things that Iraq is doing and can do to try and mitigate this risk and secure a more stable energy future for themselves.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of those efforts. Because it's not like they're just sitting there waiting for the lights to go out, right?
Right. There's definitely a sense of urgency, and they're actively pursuing a multi-pronged approach. One key aspect of that is forging strategic partnerships, particularly on the international level.
So who are they teaming up with?
Well, one of the most promising developments has been the involvement of Qatar Energy in a major solar power project being developed by Total Energies.
I think I read something about that. It's a pretty big project, right?
Yeah, we're talking about a 1.25 gigawatt solar farm, which is a huge boost to their electricity generating capacity. And Reuters.com, in their coverage of this deal, really highlighted how it's being seen as a major step towards reducing Iraq's reliance on Iranian imports.
So harnessing their own sunshine to power their own country. It's a smart move, right? Especially with all that desert.
Absolutely. And it signals a commitment to diversifying their energy mix and moving towards more sustainable sources.
Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. What about the idea of connecting their power grid with some of their neighbors in the Gulf region? I know there's been talk about that for a while.
Yeah, that's the concept behind the GCCIA, the Gulf Cooperation Council Interconnection Authority. The goal is to create a regional power grid that would allow Iraq to import electricity from countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
So spreading the risk, so to speak, not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly. But there's a catch. While this project has been in the works for some time, there have been a lot of delays. Political hurdles, technical challenges, the usual suspects.
So it's a good long-term strategy, but maybe not a quick fix for their immediate needs.
Right. It's definitely something to keep an eye on, but it's not a silver bullet.
Okay. What about those other regional partnerships? I know there's been some discussion about agreements with Jordan and Egypt as well.
Yeah, those are definitely on the table. And they represent a broader trend towards greater energy cooperation in the region, which is encouraging. But again, these are projects that are still in their early stages.
So more of a long game.
Exactly.
Mm.
It takes time to build the necessary infrastructure and finalize all the agreements. So while these partnerships hold promise for the future, they might not be able to fill a sudden and massive energy gap created by a loss of Iranian imports.
Okay, so we've talked about solar, regional grid connections, agreements with Jordan and Egypt. What about Turkey? They're right next door, and I've heard they have a fairly well-developed energy sector.
They do, and geographically it seems like a no-brainer, right? But the reality is a bit more complicated.
How so?
Well, for one thing, the relationship between Iraq and Turkey has been, let's just say, a bit rocky at times, and those geopolitical tensions can spill over into energy cooperation.
Oh, right, I see. Like maybe one country doesn't want to be too reliant on the other.
Exactly. Plus, Turkey has its own growing energy needs, so it's not like they have a surplus just waiting to be shipped over the border.
So while there might be some potential there, it's probably not a solution they can fully bank on.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like these international partnerships are crucial, but they all come with their own timelines and complexities. What about looking inward at what Iraq can do within its own borders to boost its energy independence?
That's the other side of the equation, and it's equally important. And Iraq has a major asset in its corner, natural gas.
Really, they have significant gas reserves.
Oh yeah, huge reserves. It's actually quite frustrating because right now a lot of that gas is being wasted.
Wasted. How so?
It's a byproduct of oil extraction, and instead of capturing and using it, much of it is simply flared off.
Like literally just burned into the atmosphere.
Yeah, which is terrible for the environment and a huge missed opportunity, but there's a growing focus on changing that.
Good. So what's the plan?
Developing their domestic gas production is a top priority. And one project that Wikipedia specifically mentions is the Mansouriya gas field. It's a massive field with the potential to significantly reduce Iraq's dependence on Iranian gas.
So instead of importing gas, they could be producing their own and using it to power their own plants.
Exactly. It's a no-brainer, but it still takes time and investment to get these projects up and running.
Of course. And while we're talking about developing their own resources, We can't forget about renewable energy, can we?
Absolutely not. That's a critical piece of the long-term solution. And that big solar project we discussed earlier is a great example of how Iraq is starting to embrace renewables.
Yeah, it seems like they have a lot of potential there.
Oh, tons. Solar, wind, maybe even geothermal down the line. It's all on the table.
And it's not just about diversifying their energy mix, it's about tapping into cleaner, more sustainable sources, right?
Exactly. It's about reducing their carbon footprint and aligning with global trends in energy production.
It's like a win-win-win. But it probably comes with its own set of challenges too, right?
Of course.
Uh,
It takes time to develop these large-scale renewable projects, and it requires upfront investment, but the long-term benefits are undeniable.
Speaking of long-term, we've talked a lot about building new infrastructure, developing new energy sources. But what about Iraq's existing power plants? Are they up to the task?
That's a great question, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. Many of their power plants are quite old and rely on outdated technology.
So they're probably not very efficient.
Exactly. And they've also suffered from inconsistent maintenance over the years, which leads to frequent breakdowns and further reduces their output.
So that's another area where they need to focus their efforts.
Absolutely. Modernizing these existing facilities, bringing them up to international standards, that's a crucial part of maximizing their energy independence.
Okay, so it's clear that they have a really comprehensive strategy in place, tackling the problem from multiple angles. But even with all these efforts underway, there's still this sense of urgency, isn't there? Like this feeling that they're in a race against time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's like they're trying to build a bridge while they're still crossing it.
And that's because so many of these solutions, whether it's developing new gas fields or building massive solar farms, they're long-term endeavors, right?
Absolutely. We're talking about years, not months, for some of these projects to come to fruition. And they all require significant financial resources, which can be challenging to secure, especially in a region that's faced with a lot of political and economic instability.
And then there's the security situation in certain parts of the country, which must make it incredibly difficult to even get these projects off the ground.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge factor. If you can't guarantee the safety of workers and equipment, it's hard to attract investment and make progress. And this instability can lead to delays and cost overruns, which just adds to the complexity.
And on top of all that, you have the broader geopolitical context, which is always in flux in that region.
Exactly. Energy security is never just about technical solutions. It's always intertwined with politics and regional dynamics.
So it seems like even with the best intentions and the most well-laid plans, there's still a significant amount of vulnerability, right?
Absolutely. As long as Iraq remains reliant on Iranian energy imports, they're exposed to the risk of those imports being disrupted. And in the short term, there's not a lot they can do to completely eliminate that risk.
So it's this delicate balancing act, isn't it? Trying to keep the lights on today while building a more independent future for tomorrow?
Exactly. And it's a balancing act that's made even more challenging by the fact that they're operating in a region where things can change very quickly and often unpredictably.
It's a lot to juggle, that's for sure. So for you, the listener, here are the key takeaways from our deep dive into Iraq's energy situation.
Pay close attention. This is important stuff.
First, the dependence on Iranian energy imports is real, and it's substantial. We're talking about a significant chunk of their electricity and the fuel that powers many of their own power plants.
And this dependence makes them incredibly vulnerable to disruption.
Exactly. If those imports were to suddenly stop, the consequences could be severe. We're talking about widespread power outages, a real hit to their economy, and a heightened risk of social unrest.
And all of this against a backdrop of pre-existing challenges.
Right. But here's the thing. They're not just sitting back and accepting this vulnerability.
Nope, they are proactively taking steps to change the situation.
Exactly. They're working hard to diversify their energy sources and boost their own domestic production.
And that includes forging international partnerships.
Right. We talked about those solar projects with Qatar Energy, potential grid connections with their Gulf neighbors, collaborations with Jordan and Egypt, and even the possibility of getting some electricity from Turkey.
And don't forget about developing their own natural gas reserves.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. And embracing renewable energy sources like solar and wind. They're really pulling out all the stops.
But as we've discussed, all of these efforts take time.
And money.
And a stable environment.
It's a long and complex process.
So while they're making progress, they're still in a precarious position in the short term.
They're walking this tightrope of meeting their immediate energy needs while building towards a more independent future.
It's this constant push and pull, isn't it?
It really is. And it's a reminder that energy security is about so much more than just keeping the lights on.
Yeah, it's about economic stability, public well-being, and navigating the complexities of regional politics. It's all intertwined.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this final thought.
Something to really ponder.
Given Iraq's history, its geographic location, and all those intricate relationships it has with its neighbors and the wider world, what single factor do you think will ultimately determine whether or not they succeed in achieving true energy independence?
It's a tough question, but a really important one to consider.
Because the answer, or answers, will have a profound impact not just on Iraq, but on the entire region. So until next time, keep thinking critically, stay engaged, and keep those lights on.
And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to energy.